On March 14, 1989, at approximately 4:17 in the afternoon, a middle-aged man walked through the automatic doors of a Walmart supercenter in Falls Church, Virginia, pushing an empty shopping cart with the casual demeanor of someone picking up groceries after work. He wore a beige windbreaker, khaki pants, and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the fluorescent lighting as he made his way past the seasonal display of Easter candy. To every other customer in the store that day, he was invisible, unremarkable, just another face in the crowd of suburban shoppers navigating the wide aisles on a Wednesday afternoon. But to the 12 FBI agents positioned throughout that Walmart, concealed among genuine customers and disguised as store employees, this man was the culmination of a 7-year counterintelligence operation that had consumed thousands of investigative hours and stretched across 3 presidential administrations. His name was Viktor Mikhailovich Chernov, and for nearly a decade, he had been one of the most successful Soviet intelligence officers ever to operate on American soil. The story of how Viktor Chernov came to be arrested inside a discount retail store begins not in the suburbs of Virginia, but in the classified briefing rooms of Langley and the shadowy world of Cold War espionage that defined the 1980s. Throughout that decade, American counterintelligence officials had become increasingly aware of a problem they couldn't quite define: a persistent hemorrhaging of sensitive information that suggested the presence of a highly placed Soviet asset with access to compartmentalized intelligence. Documents were going missing from secure facilities, encrypted communications were being intercepted with suspicious frequency, and agents in Eastern Europe were being rolled up by KGB counterintelligence with alarming regularity. The pattern was unmistakable to those trained to see it, but the source remained frustratingly elusive. Viktor Chernov had entered the United States in September 1982 under deep cover, meaning he came not as a declared Soviet diplomat with immunity, but as an illegal, a spy with no official protection and a completely fabricated identity. According to the documentation he carried, he was Michael Vernon, a technical writer born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who had spent the previous decade working for various engineering firms across the Midwest. The legend, as intelligence agencies call these constructed identities, was nearly perfect. The Soviets had been building it for years, establishing a paper trail that included tax returns, employment records, even a marriage license from a brief union that had ended in divorce in 1978. The real Michael Vernon had died in a car accident in 1973 at the age of 23, and Soviet intelligence had simply resurrected him, aging him appropriately and filling in the missing years with carefully crafted documentation. What made Chernov particularly dangerous was not just the quality of his cover, but his operational patience and his understanding of how American society actually functioned. Unlike some illegals who maintained suspicious isolation or displayed behavioral patterns that marked them as foreign, Chernov embedded himself thoroughly in the fabric of suburban American life. He rented a modest townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, joined a local Rotary Club, volunteered occasionally at a community center, and maintained a low-level job as a technical consultant for various defense contractors. He dated occasionally, but never seriously, maintained friendships that were warm but not intimate, and generally presented as the kind of middle-aged bachelor who had settled into a comfortable, if unremarkable, routine. Neighbors would later tell FBI investigators that he was pleasant, quiet, helpful with things like jump-starting cars or lending tools, but that they realized, looking back, that they knew almost nothing substantive about him. The technical consultant position was, of course, the key to everything. Through a series of carefully managed contracts with different firms in the defense and aerospace sectors, Chernov gained access to facilities and personnel that handled classified information. He never pushed for access he shouldn't have, never displayed unusual interest in restricted materials, never did anything that would trigger a security review. Instead, he cultivated relationships with people who did have access, becoming the kind of colleague who was easy to talk to over lunch, who understood the technical details of complex projects, who could be trusted with professional frustrations and workplace gossip. Through these relationships, through his own legitimate access to certain unclassified documents, and through what investigators would later describe as an almost supernatural ability to assemble intelligence from fragments and peripheral sources, Chernov constructed a remarkably complete picture of American defense capabilities, weapons systems in development, and counterintelligence operations. His tradecraft was exceptional. He used no communications equipment in his home, maintained no suspicious contacts with Soviet officials, and never visited the Soviet embassy or known intelligence officers. Instead, he employed a system of dead drops, pre-arranged locations where he would leave packages of documents or microfilm to be collected by couriers who had no idea they were serving as cutouts in an intelligence operation. A park bench in Georgetown, a hollow brick in a wall near a jogging trail, a magnetic container affixed to the underframe of a specific park bench in Rock Creek Park. These locations would be serviced by individuals who thought they were helping a friend move money or documents for entirely innocent reasons, or sometimes by tourists and visiting academics who were themselves Soviet intelligence officers but who never met Chernov directly. The system was elegant in its simplicity and its security. Even if one link was compromised, the chain wouldn't lead back to him. The FBI's awareness that someone like Chernov existed began with a defector in 1985, a mid-level KGB officer who had provided information during his debriefing sessions about a highly productive, illegal operating somewhere in the Washington, D.C. area. The defector had never met this agent, didn't know his name or his specific location, but had seen reporting that was attributed to an asset codenamed Prospect, Russian for avenue or prospect. The intelligence Prospect was providing was described as consistently high quality, technically detailed, and difficult to obtain, suggesting someone with long-term access rather than a temporary visitor or someone who had managed a one-time theft. This was the first thread, and it would take years to follow it to its source. The investigation that would eventually be codenamed Operation Silent Thunder became one of the most intensive counterintelligence efforts of the decade. FBI teams began the painstaking process of analyzing every security breach, every document that had gone missing, every classified program that seemed to have been compromised, looking for patterns that might point to a single source. They cross-referenced personnel with access, looked for financial anomalies, travel patterns, anything that might indicate an individual living beyond their means or maintaining suspicious contacts. The problem was the sheer volume of people with some level of security clearance in the Washington area. Tens of thousands of individuals worked in positions that handled classified information, and the FBI was looking for someone who, by design, left almost no trace. The break came from an unexpected direction in late 1987. A Soviet intelligence officer who had been posted to the United Nations in New York, a man named Valery Yurchenko, who had previously defected and then, bizarrely, re-defected back to the Soviet Union, had, during his brief time in American custody, mentioned a detail about the operational protocols used by deep-cover illegals. He described how some of the most valuable assets were instructed to maintain what he called normalization rituals, regular activities that were so completely American, so utterly typical, that they would serve as both cover and as a kind of psychological anchor for officers who might otherwise start to display behavioral stress from the isolation and constant deception of their roles. These activities could be anything from bowling leagues to church attendance to shopping at specific stores at regular times. One of the FBI analysts working on the Prospect case, a woman named Catherine Reeves, who would later receive a CIA intelligence medal for her work, became interested in this detail. She began looking at patterns not in security breaches or classified access, but in the mundane routines of individuals who had some connection, however peripheral, to compromised information. She was looking for people who maintained regular patterns that seemed almost too regular, too deliberately normal. When she cross-referenced this approach with lists of technical consultants who had worked for multiple defense contractors over the past 5 years, a relatively small pool of names emerged. One of them was Michael Vernon. Vernon's background seemed solid on first examination, but when investigators began pulling deeper into his history, tiny inconsistencies started to appear. A former employer from his supposed work history in the 1970s had no record of him, though the tax documents said he'd worked there. A college transcript showed grades in classes that hadn't been offered that semester. A reference from a supervisor who, when finally located, had no memory of him at all. Each inconsistency was small enough to be explained by clerical error or faulty memory, but together they suggested something more deliberate. By early 1988, the FBI had Michael Vernon under surveillance. What they discovered was both fascinating and frustrating. Vernon, who they were now increasingly convinced was a Soviet illegal, maintained an extraordinarily careful lifestyle. He went to work, came home, occasionally went out for dinner or to a movie, visited a gym 3 times a week, and every Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, he drove to the Walmart in Falls Church and did his grocery shopping. The Sunday shopping trips were so regular that surveillance teams could set their watches by them. He would park in roughly the same area, enter the store, spend between 45 minutes and an hour shopping, and then leave with several bags of groceries. He paid in cash, rarely spoke to anyone beyond brief pleasantries with cashiers, and never did anything that would draw attention. For months, the FBI watched and waited, building a comprehensive picture of his activities, documenting his contacts, searching for the moment when he would do something that would provide proof of espionage. They needed to catch him in the act of collecting or passing classified information, not just establish that he was living under a false identity. The legal threshold for an espionage prosecution required evidence of actual intelligence activity, not just suspicious behavior. Meanwhile, counterintelligence officials were becoming increasingly concerned about what Chernov might be learning and passing to Moscow. The longer they watched without acting, the more potential damage he could cause. But if they moved too soon, without sufficient evidence, they might lose him entirely, and with him any chance of understanding the full scope of his operation. The FBI's strategy became one of progressive pressure. They began to very carefully, very subtly, let Chernov know he was being watched. A surveillance car would be just visible in his rearview mirror for slightly too long. An agent would appear in the same restaurant where he was having lunch 2 days in a row. Nothing overt enough to be definitive, but enough that a trained intelligence officer would recognize the signs. The goal was to make him nervous, to push him toward making a mistake, toward trying to signal his handlers or attempting to access his emergency communication protocols. If they could catch him in the act of making contact with Soviet intelligence, they would have their case. The pressure campaign extended through the fall of 1988 and into early 1989. Chernov's behavior began to show signs of stress. He started varying his routes to work, spending more time checking for surveillance, becoming more cautious in his interactions. But he didn't break protocol, didn't attempt to contact the Soviet embassy, didn't do anything that would give the FBI the evidence they needed. Then, in March 1989, something changed. One of the FBI's electronic surveillance teams, monitoring communications in a way that would not be publicly detailed for many years, intercepted a fragment of a coded message that analysts believed was connected to the Prospect network. The message referenced a contingency meeting, an emergency protocol to be used only if an illegal was in imminent danger of exposure. The time and location were embedded in the coded text, and after careful analysis, FBI cryptologists believed they had identified the location as somewhere in a commercial area of Falls Church, possibly a store or shopping center, on March 14th in the late afternoon. The decision was made at the highest levels of the FBI and CIA to move on that date. If Chernov was going to attempt to make contact with his handlers or retrieve emergency documents and funds that might be hidden in a dead drop, this was the moment they would catch him. The question was where exactly in Falls Church he would go. The FBI had teams prepared to cover multiple locations, but they were banking on one possibility that seemed most likely given Chernov's established patterns. If he needed to do something in Falls Church that would provide cover, that wouldn't seem suspicious, even if he was being followed. There was one place he went regularly, predictably, every week: the Walmart. March 14th, 1989, was a Wednesday, not Chernov's usual Sunday shopping day, which added credence to the FBI's theory that something unusual was happening. Surveillance teams picked him up as he left his townhouse at 3:45 p.m., earlier than his normal shopping time, and followed him as he drove directly to the Falls Church Walmart. FBI agents were already in position throughout the store. Some were dressed as customers, pushing carts and browsing aisles. Others were in the back room, coordinating with store management, who had been briefed on the operation just hours before. One agent had been placed at the photo development counter, another at the customer service desk. Two were positioned in the parking lot, watching the entrance. The plan was to observe, to wait for Chernov to do whatever he had come to do, and then to intercept him before he could leave. Chernov entered the store at 4:17, and for the first 20 minutes, he appeared to be shopping normally. He picked up a carton of milk, some bread, several cans of soup. He moved through the aisles with the same casual pace he always displayed. But FBI agents who had been watching him for months noticed subtle differences in his behavior. He was more alert than usual, his eyes moving constantly, scanning the store. He paused at the end of aisles as if checking to see if anyone was following. Near the back of the store, in the section that sold automotive supplies and hardware, he stopped at a display of motor oil, picked up a container, examined it, and then put it back. He did this several times, his movements deliberate and specific. Watching agents realized what was happening. This was counter-surveillance behavior, a way of checking his surroundings while appearing to be engaged in a normal shopping activity. After several minutes near the automotive section, Chernov pushed his cart toward the rear of the store, toward the area where the restrooms were located. He left his cart near a display of paper towels and walked into the men's restroom. This was the moment the FBI had been waiting for. Two agents immediately moved to positions near the restroom entrance, while others spread out to cut off potential exits. Inside the restroom, Chernov went directly to the third stall from the door, the one farthest from the entrance. He entered it, locked the door, and for nearly 3 minutes, there was silence. What happened in those 3 minutes was reconstructed later from physical evidence and Chernov's eventual confession. Behind the toilet in that stall, there was a removable panel that accessed the plumbing. It had been modified slightly, imperceptibly to anyone not looking for it, to create a small, hollow space. Inside that space was a waterproof container, and inside that container was a different life. A Canadian passport under a different name, $5,000 in cash, a set of contact protocols for emergency exfiltration, and a list of dead drops and safe houses that extended from Virginia to the Canadian border. This was Chernov's escape kit, placed there months earlier through methods the FBI never fully determined, meant to be accessed only in a situation where his cover was completely blown and he needed to run. When Chernov emerged from the restroom, he was carrying the waterproof container in a plastic Walmart bag he had taken from a rack near the entrance. He had placed it among the other items in his shopping cart, trying to make it look like just another purchase. He pushed the cart back through the store, now moving more quickly than before, his demeanor noticeably different. The casual suburban shopper was gone, replaced by someone who knew he was running out of time. He abandoned the cart near the checkout lanes and began walking rapidly toward the exit, carrying only the plastic bag. He made it approximately 30 feet from the automatic doors before FBI Special Agent Thomas Brennan stepped in front of him and said, "Michael Vernon, or whoever you are, FBI, you need to come with us." Chernov stopped immediately, and for just a moment, witnesses would later say, he looked almost relieved. He didn't resist, didn't try to run, didn't reach for anything that might have been a weapon or a suicide device. He simply said, "I want to speak to an attorney," and allowed himself to be handcuffed. The arrest took place in front of approximately 15 shocked Walmart customers who had no idea they had just witnessed the end of one of the most significant counterintelligence operations of the Cold War. The arrest of Viktor Chernov, whose true identity was confirmed through fingerprint analysis conducted by the FBI and cross-referenced with Soviet intelligence records later obtained through liaison services, represented both a triumph and a frustration for American counterintelligence. The triumph was obvious. A deep-cover illegal had been caught in the act of attempting to use his escape protocols, providing clear evidence of his espionage activities. The frustration was equally clear. While they had caught Chernov, they had not caught him in the act of passing classified information, which meant building a comprehensive case about exactly what he had stolen and what damage he had done would be extraordinarily difficult. Chernov himself was not cooperating. After his initial statement requesting an attorney, he had said virtually nothing. What followed was a complex legal and diplomatic dance that would take place largely out of public view. The Reagan administration was in its final year, soon to transition to George H.W. Bush, and the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was in a period of cautious thaw. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika were changing the nature of Cold War tensions, and while espionage certainly continued, there was a growing recognition on both sides that certain confrontations could be managed through negotiation rather than escalation. The arrest of a Soviet illegal on American soil was exactly the kind of incident that could either be used to score propaganda points or could be quietly resolved through the intelligence channels that connected Washington and Moscow even at the height of the Cold War. Within weeks of Chernov's arrest, Soviet officials began making carefully worded inquiries through back channels about the possibility of a trade. They didn't acknowledge that Chernov was one of theirs. Officially, they maintained that they had no idea who Viktor Chernov was, and that the man arrested in Falls Church was simply Michael Vernon, an American citizen being falsely accused. But through intelligence liaisons, through diplomatic contacts, through the quiet conversations that took place between professionals who understood how the game was played, a different message was being conveyed. If the United States had someone they wanted back, someone who was currently in Soviet custody, arrangements might be made. The United States did indeed have someone they wanted back, though the details of this person's identity remain classified to this day. What is known, and what has been confirmed through declassified documents and careful reporting by journalists who covered the intelligence community, is that an American intelligence officer had been arrested in Eastern Europe in 1986 and was being held in a Soviet facility on espionage charges. This officer, whose name has never been publicly released and whose family has been kept under a veil of classification that extends even to whether this person was male or female, had been working on a particularly sensitive operation that was compromised through means that remain unclear. For 3 years, the CIA and State Department had been working to secure this officer's release, but the Soviets had shown no interest in negotiating until Chernov was arrested. The negotiations were handled through intelligence channels rather than diplomatic ones, which is often the case with spy swaps. The FBI had an interest in prosecuting Chernov, in bringing him to trial and exposing the scope of his operations, both as a deterrent to other Soviet illegals and as a way of understanding what had been compromised. But the CIA had an overriding interest in getting their officer back, someone who had been trained at enormous expense, who had risked their life for American intelligence interests, and who was suffering under conditions of imprisonment that were reported to be deteriorating. The decision about which interest would prevail ultimately went to the White House, and the decision came back in favor of making the trade. The negotiations took months. Both sides had to verify that the people they would be receiving were actually who they claimed to be, that they were in acceptable health, that the exchange could be carried out without either side gaining a tactical advantage. There were discussions about locations, about timing, about who would be present. The Soviets initially proposed conducting the exchange at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, the famous crossing point between East and West that had been used for previous spy swaps, but American negotiators pushed for a different location, somewhere less symbolic and less likely to attract media attention. Eventually, they settled on a location in Vienna, Austria, a neutral city where both American and Soviet intelligence services maintained significant presences and where such exchanges could be conducted with some degree of discretion. On October 7, 1989, less than a month before the Berlin Wall would fall and change the nature of the Cold War forever, Viktor Chernov was taken from the federal detention facility where he had been held since his arrest and transported to Andrews Air Force Base. He was flown, under heavy guard, to Austria on a military aircraft. The American intelligence officer, whose identity remains classified, was brought from Soviet custody to the same location through similar arrangements. The actual exchange took place in a hotel conference room in Vienna, a deliberately mundane setting that was chosen specifically to avoid the drama and publicity of earlier Cold War spy swaps. According to the limited information that has been released, the exchange itself was brief and professional. Chernov and the American officer were brought into the room from opposite doors, each accompanied by representatives of their respective intelligence services. There was a moment of verification, where officials from each side confirmed the identity of the person they were receiving. Then, with minimal ceremony, the two walked past each other, going from one set of handlers to the other. Chernov was received by Soviet officials, who immediately took him out of the hotel and to a waiting aircraft. The American officer was received by CIA officials who did the same. The entire exchange took less than 15 minutes. Viktor Chernov returned to the Soviet Union, and for a time, that appeared to be the end of his story. He was received as a returning hero by the KGB, given what was described as a comfortable position in Moscow, and effectively disappeared from Western intelligence awareness. But the Soviet Union itself was in its final years, and when the USSR collapsed in 1991, a great deal of information about Cold War intelligence operations began to leak out through various channels, including KGB officers who found themselves suddenly unemployed and willing to talk to Western journalists and intelligence agencies for the right price. Through these sources, a more complete picture of Chernov's operation began to emerge. According to information provided by former KGB officers and later partially confirmed through documents released by Russian intelligence services seeking to demonstrate their Cold War successes, Viktor Chernov, operating as Michael Vernon, had during his 7 years in the United States successfully identified and reported on more than 40 classified American defense and intelligence programs. He had provided detailed information on electronic warfare systems being developed for the Air Force, on satellite reconnaissance capabilities, on counterintelligence operations targeting Soviet diplomatic personnel, and on at least 3 significant technological developments that the Soviet military used to adapt their own systems. The intelligence he provided was described by one former KGB officer in an interview with a Western journalist as being equivalent to what might be obtained by having access to a very well-placed mole in multiple defense agencies simultaneously. Even though Chernov himself never had that level of access, his genius was in aggregation, in taking pieces of information from dozens of different sources and assembling them into a comprehensive picture. The question of how much damage Chernov actually did to American national security is one that intelligence historians continue to debate. The CIA has never fully declassified its damage assessment, and probably never will, since doing so would require revealing exactly what secrets were compromised and how they were obtained. Former intelligence officials who have spoken on the record, usually years after their retirement, have suggested that while Chernov was certainly successful by the standards of Soviet intelligence operations, the information he provided did not fundamentally alter the balance of the Cold War. The United States maintained its technological and intelligence advantages, and the programs he compromised were either adapted or, in some cases, were already known to be vulnerable. But other analysts have argued that this assessment underestimates the cumulative effect of his reporting, that having detailed information on American capabilities allowed Soviet military planners to make decisions and allocations of resources that they otherwise would not have made, and that this had strategic implications that may not have been immediately apparent. What is clear is that the FBI's operation to identify and arrest Chernov was considered a significant success within the counterintelligence community. It demonstrated that even the most carefully constructed illegal identity could be penetrated through patient analysis and the application of the right investigative techniques. The fact that he was caught in a Walmart, of all places, became something of a legend within the FBI, a story that was told to new counterintelligence agents as an example of how espionage in the real world was often far more mundane than its depiction in movies and novels. There was no car chase, no shootout, no dramatic confrontation at a scenic location. Just a middle-aged man in a suburban discount store, trying to retrieve his escape kit from behind a toilet, and being arrested by agents who had been watching him shop for groceries every Sunday for months. The American intelligence officer who was traded for Chernov returned to the United States and was reportedly debriefed extensively about their time in Soviet custody and about the operation that had led to their capture. Beyond that, almost nothing is publicly known. The CIA has kept this person's identity classified under what is known as a permanent cover status, meaning that even decades later, their name, their assignment, and the circumstances of their arrest remain protected. Families of CIA officers who went missing or were captured during the Cold War have occasionally speculated that their loved one might have been the person traded for Chernov. but the agency has never confirmed or denied any of these theories. What is known is that this person survived, was brought home, and was able to resume some kind of life after years of imprisonment, which, given the circumstances, represents its own kind of success story. The Walmart remains open today, though it has been renovated and expanded several times since 1989. The restroom where he retrieved his escape kit has been remodeled, the panel behind the toilet has been replaced, and there is nothing to indicate that anything unusual ever happened there. The FBI does not mark the locations of its operations with plaques or historical markers, and so the site of one of the most successful counterintelligence operations of the Cold War is now just another American retail space, frequented by people who have no idea of the history beneath their feet. This anonymity is entirely appropriate for an operation that was, from beginning to end, about the hidden nature of intelligence work, about the fact that the most significant events in the secret war between superpowers often took place in the most ordinary locations. In the years since 1989, the story of Viktor Chernov has become one of those Cold War espionage cases that is discussed primarily within the intelligence community and among historians specializing in that era. It has not achieved the public recognition of cases like Aldrich Ames or Robert Hansen, perhaps because Chernov was not an American who betrayed his country, but a Soviet officer who was, by the standards of his service, doing his job well. There is something in the American conception of espionage that finds traitors more compelling than foreign spies, perhaps because betrayal cuts deeper than simple opposition. But within the FBI and CIA, within the offices where counterintelligence officers still work to identify foreign intelligence operations on American soil, the Chernov case is remembered as an example of what patient, methodical investigation can achieve even against an adversary who has been trained to be invisible. The collapse of the Soviet Union 2 years after Chernov's arrest and the end of the Cold War changed the nature of these operations, but it did not end them. Russian intelligence services and those of many other nations continue to run illegals in the United States. Officers with deep cover identities who live seemingly ordinary lives while collecting information on American capabilities and intentions. The techniques have evolved, the technologies have changed, but the fundamental nature of the work remains the same. And somewhere in the FBI's counterintelligence division, analysts are still looking at patterns, still trying to identify those tiny inconsistencies in someone's background that might indicate a constructed identity, still watching people shop for groceries and wondering who they really are. Viktor Chernov himself, after his return to the Soviet Union and the subsequent collapse of that state, largely disappeared from public view. There have been occasional reports over the years from journalists who claim to have tracked him down, living quietly in Moscow or St. Petersburg, but none of these reports have been definitively confirmed. If he is still alive, he would be in his 80s now, an old man carrying memories of a world that no longer exists, of a time when the stakes felt existential and when the work he did seemed to matter in the grand sweep of history. Whether he looks back on his time as Michael Vernon with pride or regret, whether he thinks about his arrest in that Walmart and wonders if he made some mistake that gave him away, these are questions that only he can answer, and he has chosen not to speak publicly about any of it. What remains is the story itself, a story that captures something essential about the nature of espionage during the Cold War. It was not, for the most part, the glamorous, action-packed adventure depicted in popular culture. It was patient, methodical, often tedious work, carried out by people who understood that success was measured in small increments, in information gathered piece by piece, in identities maintained year after year without breaking character. Viktor Chernov was good at this work, perhaps exceptionally good, and he might have continued indefinitely if not for a defector's fragmentary information, an analyst's intuition about normalization rituals, and the slow, steady accumulation of evidence that eventually pointed the FBI to a townhouse in Arlington and a shopping routine in Falls Church. In the end, 7 years of careful work came down to 3 minutes in a bathroom stall and 30 feet between that stall and the Walmart exit, a distance he did not quite cross before his particular war came to an end.